The last two lectures, we talked about primarily about the development of early modern warfare, both in Europe and in the Islamic nations of the Middle East and the Indian subcontinent, the Mughal Empire, as well as took a broader look at the gunpowder empires of Islam as they pertain to the larger narrative across the world. Today, I want to talk about kind of a counter narrative to all of that. I want to talk to you today about what was happening in the New World, and specifically this concept of Native American conquistador. Now, first thing I want to admit, I did give this to the Docent Academy several years ago. It was not recorded at the time. And while I did do this talk several years ago, a lot more has been published since then. So I'm going to try to incorporate that into this talk, as well as there is an amazing article coming out by David Snow about the Indios Amigos on the Coronado expedition in a volume later this year, which will be called A Friend of Kuaua, Papers in Honor of James Condor, our former president of the Friends of Coronado Historic Site. The first thing I like to do with this talk is actually show you that there are actually four different arguments, perspectives, as far as the conquest of the New World, how you view the conquest of the New World. And we're really going to be talking about the last one. But the four are the military conquest, the spiritual conquest, no conquest, or whose conquest. All of these have issues. The one you're probably most familiar with is the military conquest, right? The Spanish came and conquered everything, and it's based on Spanish accounts that they came, they saw, they conquered, right? It focuses on people like Cortez and Pizarro having been masterful generals and soldiers, and the idea that hundreds triumphed over thousands. And conversely, even the Black Legend is based on this, right? So even the Black Legend, so even if you take an English perspective, and the Spanish were brutal murderers, the idea is that the Spanish had the power to be brutal murderers, that they had all the power in the world. They were great military masters, and the only thing they couldn't control was their appetite for gold and silver, right? There's problems with this, and we see these problems actually in some of the archival records of all things. So, for example, this example of siege warfare at Tenochtitlan really brings into the idea that it was some sort of glorious military conquest. I'm going to read this to you just real quickly. But during this time, the Spaniards mounted a wooden catapult on the temple platform to fling stones at the Indians. While it was being set up, the Indians who gathered in Amajak, I'm sorry, I'm probably not pronouncing that right, came out to stare at it. Then they released it like a great sling, but the stone did not fall among the Indians. It flew over their heads and crashed into a corner of the marketplace. This seemed to cause an argument among the Spaniards, but they still could not aim the machine correctly. It threw out stones in every direction. Does that sound like a military genius? No, that sounds like somebody who doesn't know what they're doing. And most of the conquistadors really didn't know what they were doing. In fact, in other talks I've given, I've made the argument that conquistadors were not professional soldiers and perhaps were better suited with the term adventurer. These are people that were looking to stake their claim. These weren't the military masterminds of such as El Gran Capitan, the figure we looked at, Gonzalo de Cordoba, who fought in the Italian wars. A lot of the nobility that came out to the New World, the Spanish nobility that came out, were not like the top-ranked nobility that had studied at under the best people or at the best colleges. Here's another example, right? Spanish are great conquerors, and yet we have this account of how they conquered. This is about the massacre at the festival of Toxcatl. The Spanish, ran in among the dancers, forcing their way to the place where the drums played. They attacked the man who was drumming and cut off his arms. Then they cut off his head, and it rolled across the floor. Then they struck others in the shoulders, and their arms were torn from their bodies. They wounded some in the thigh and some in the calf. They slashed others in the abdomen, and their entrails spilled out to the floor. Some attempted to run away, but their intestines dragged as they ran. They seemed to tangle their feet in their own entrails. No matter how they tried to save themselves, they could not escape. Well, that's certainly dark, but it doesn't really show a good military sense of fighting on the part of the Spanish. And while this account does bring into notions of the Black legend, it's certainly certainly not the only way to interpret it. The Black legend really was developed in Protestant countries primarily as a way of justifying their own wars against the Spanish, not necessarily because of their concern with indigenous people. Moreover, Protestant peoples and other European nations or even Asian powers were equally as guilty as performing these atrocities. And in fact, other indigenous peoples actually performed these atrocities as well. So the next topic or the next concept is the idea of a spiritual conquest, right? So maybe the Spanish didn't conquer militarily. Maybe the fact that these are all great Catholic countries today, lots of Latin America is Catholic. Maybe Spain's real legacy in the New World was a spiritual conquest. And that really it's associated, even the military aspects are couched in a spiritual conquest that started with the Reconquista and the bitter conflict with Islam. And that this was the conquest of the New World was just an extension of what had happened in the Iberian Peninsula. Well, there's problems with that as well. First and foremost is the fact of indigenous revolts, right? Usually when an indigenous revolt occurred, people killed the indigenous people killed the priests first. So they were hardly converted in most cases, or at least converted willingly. There's a great problem with that, the targeting of these populations. But also, if we look at Catholicism in the New World, it is not the Catholicism practiced in Rome. In many places around New Spain and elsewhere, it's a form of folk Catholicism, which actually incorporated a lot of different, and I apologize, I'm in my office. Dia de los Muertos is a good example of folk Catholicism, right, in central Mexico. It's pretty much a Christian holiday that did not exist in the Old World, but was developed as a way of linking the Latin All Souls Day with worship of the goddess Mitakahuatl, the goddess of the skulls, right? This was originally practiced by Aztecs using human skulls. So obviously today, those skulls are swapped with sugar skulls and things of that nature, but it's still a non-Christian holiday taking on Christian aspects. So many of the practices people in Latin America celebrate today are still things that are rooted in their indigenous past, not necessarily their Christian past. They've wed those two things together. Okay, the third concept, I'm going to go through these really quickly, is no contact conquest, right? That if you look at people, living in the Spanish Empire, they're a mix of all these different ethnicities, that nobody was conquered and removed, that everybody just intermingled with somebody else. And of course, Mexico today is a great example, right? The Mexican government claims they're both indigenous and European, and certainly also have African roots as well. And this argument really focuses on the fact that, yes, there was social upheaval, but it was primarily the result of infectious disease sweeps and technological change. So anytime you're going to have a drastic technological change, you're going to have a change in how those societies function. A great example in our own lifetime is, of course, the information age, right? The development of the computer. How we live today is not how people lived 100 years ago. So why would we expect people living pre-European contact to be living the same way 100 years after that contact? We wouldn't. Right? The world's changed quite a bit for those people. It doesn't mean they've disappeared. It doesn't mean they were necessarily conquered. In many ways, their culture was adopted by Europeans. So that's one of those arguments. There's problems with that, right? Because the reasons for population decline are disease, migration, and warfare. And these are all associated with European arrival and in European conquest. More importantly, to say there was no conquest, and yet we get this huge state of New Spain, which includes Mexico, most of Central America, the Caribbean, much of, more than 50% of the United States was actually a part of New Spain. The Philippines and even Cambodia were part of New Spain at various times. Those are all reasons to make the argument. Yeah, there definitely was a conquest. We can see, if we can point to a map where there's a nation, a different nation that had once been there, then absolutely there was a conquest. And the last one is the idea of, well, it could have been a military conquest. It could have been a spiritual conquest. It could have been no conquest. But really, whose conquest was it? And the idea of this is based on the fact that the overwhelming majority of participants in the Spanish conquest of the New World were Native American. The overwhelming majority. They contributed the political, logistical, and military expertise that made the conquest possible and sustainable. So the only reason Spain was able to take those lands from indigenous people was because indigenous people participated in that conquest. Spain didn't have the numbers of people coming aboard the few ships that came every year to conquer the New World. They needed Native American peoples to buy into their conquest. There's problems with this, of course, too. This is an example on campaign in New Galicia. These are indigenous peoples campaigning for Spain. Seeing the lord of this city of Mexico, who was named Tapia, and the lord of Tlatelolco, and the lord of Tlaxcala, and the lord of Huehuetenango, and many other lords and principals from this province of Kuaua, how bad their health was, and that they had hardly a subject remained who was not dying, or necessities they experienced. They went and begged for mercy from Nuno de Guzman, for the hope that they would be able to return. He could take their jewels and ornaments of war and let them return to Jalisco, which was a healthier country to spend the winter. I know that not one of these lords who went to plead escaped, and that they all died. So if your soldiers all die, that's obviously they're not participating in the conquest. They don't want to be participating in the conquest. But perhaps a more damning account of that same expedition comes from Garcia del Pilar. And he says, at the end of the expedition, those who hadn't died of disease or begged to go home or died on the battlefield, he said, at the last few of the natives that still served us, this is what happened to them. Then all the Indians we had brought with us were distributed among the Spaniards in lots of 4 and 10. Each Spaniard shackled his, and the Indians were even sold among them. Of the 1,200 Tlaxcalans who went with us, no more than 20 survived, and those are in chains. So not a real great existence. So which is the right perspective? Well, there are supporters of all 4 ideas, and they're all equally valid. The reality is there's a lot of gray area, and there's contradictory nature of how the conquest occurred in many different regions. And it's easy to make broad arguments, but certainly every human being's experiences were different, and we have to consider the role of personal agency or personal choice in how people contributed to the conquest of the New World. But with that said, I'm going to focus on the perspective of whose conquest. So I'm not saying the military, spiritual, or no conquest are not valid concepts, but I'm going to focus on the fact, the concept that Native Americans were the primary people involved in the conquest of the New World. Let's talk a little bit about how whose conquest works. Well, first and foremost, Native Americans typically represented 75 to 95% of all participants in Spanish expeditionary forces and armies in the New World. That is to say, in any given battle, 3/4 of the people fighting under the Spanish flag were at least indigenous peoples. And while these are often uncredited or vaguely referenced, they do exist in the Spanish documents. And moreover, it wasn't just Native Americans who participated with the Spanish. It was one particular subset of Native American peoples that really adopted and bought into the Spanish way of life. And those were the vast majority of those people were living in and around the Valley of Mexico. Here is a quote from Francisco Bracamonte in testament to what he says. I fought beside these Indians and have seen their loyalty in the great service they have done for your majesty. They have fought and suffered along beside us, and many a Spanish soldier owes them his life. I can say in all honesty that without them, we would have never conquered this land. Another account. This is an account by indigenous peoples themselves. We left behind our lands and our families in order to come to this province and to serve our lords, the Spaniards, and to aid and help them in their conquest. And in this dangerous duty, we have always served and fought beside them as their friends. We have always served His Majesty with our own persons, our arms, and our servants in the conquest and defense of this land. And even after the conquest, we have served in times of need for defense and against rebels by land and corsairs that have come by sea. In all of this, we have served voluntarily. So where are these guys coming from? Well, there's two primary empires in which Native American conquistadors came from. The first is, of course, the Aztec or Mexica Empire. Those are the ones you see kind of in a purplish color. And then in the green color to the left were the Tarascan or Perpetua Empire. There were also a number of smaller kingdoms and confederacies that also helped. Most notable of those is the Tlaxcalan Confederacy, which is located in that gray area just east of Tenochtitlan. So what made them such great conquistadors? Well, we know quite a bit about Mesoamerican warfare. Specifically, the anonymous conquistador says quite a bit about how indigenous peoples fought and how they were ideal as fighters. He says this of Mexican peoples. They are very warlike, fearless of death. They used to have great wars and differences among themselves. They have their military system, for they have generals and also captains of 400 and 200 men. Each company has its standard bearer with the insignia on a staff tied to his back. It is their custom to reward a man who serves well in war or performs some outstanding feat. Even though he may be the lowest slave among them, they make him a captain and lord, giving him vassals and honoring him. While this concept may seem, well, of course, they had merit-based promotion. Most militaries do, right? This was an alien concept to most of Europe. Instead, your rank was determined upon your status at birth for the most part. It was based upon who your parents were or who your parents had been. It was very uncommon to receive merit-based promotions. But here we can see that very clearly in the Aztec Empire, merit-based promotion was very important. In fact, even a slave could become a lord through distinguishing themselves in military service. He goes on to say this, which is perhaps even more interesting. He says, anyone facing them for the first time can be terrified by their screams and their ferocity. In warfare, they are the most cruel people to be found, for they spare neither brothers, relatives, friends, nor women, even if they are beautiful. They kill them all and eat them. When they cannot take the enemy plunder and booty with them, they burn everything, which is a nice way of saying that these people conduct total war. They're very violent and very efficient at it. In fact, more efficient than the Spanish are. In fact, we read these violent accounts about the Spaniards, and the first thing that comes to mind when you read the anonymous conquistadors thing is, were many of these atrocities performed by other indigenous peoples based upon this man's comments? And it's possible that some of the atrocities, not all of the atrocities, were done by other indigenous peoples. Indigenous peoples are human too, and can often, any person is capable of committing war crimes. So what do these armies look like? Well, these are large forces, sometimes consisting of over 10,000 soldiers. They're highly organized companies with merit-based promotions, and they fight this total war that'll focus on terror tactics targeting the civilian population. Here we can see the Aztec army preparing for a war somewhere in the Valley of Mexico or that surrounding area. So what did they use in these wars? Well, Mesoamerican civilizations had a pretty elaborate weapon system. They had atlatls, which are spear throwers. They had bows, very large bows that are actually fairly similar to the English longbow. They had a sword, which is they called a macahuitl. It was an obsidian-edged war club, but it worked just like a sword. You could slash with it. They used mauls, or what we would call maces, and often with a copper or stone head. They had slings. And then lastly, they had this thing. If you'll notice, the guy in the middle and wearing all white is carrying like a spear, which they called a Tiwa-speaking, which is this obsidian-edged like spear or halberd that they could carry and kind of jab at you or swing at you from behind the ranks. They also had armor. Most of their armor was made up of cotton, but they also carried wicker shields. Often these were elaborately, both the cotton shirts or cotton suits and wicker shields were elaborately decorated with different colors based upon their company, based upon their rank. And many of the more elite soldiers would actually wear hardwood helmets with animal or demon designs in them, usually with the warrior's head emerging from the mouth of the beast. This hardwood could easily deflect a macahuitl blow. It could, it obviously protected against projectiles such as sling stones and arrows. They were very well equipped for fighting the kinds of wars they fought. There was also some ethnic variability amongst these groups, and we see this in Spanish accounts. For example, accounts that we get from the Flower Wars between the Aztec Empire and the Tlaxcalan Confederacy make it clear that the Tlaxcalans really liked the bow. They were the English of Mesoamerica, as it were. They really liked the bow. The Mixtec were renowned for using the atlatl, and the Mexica themselves, the Aztecs themselves, really liked to get into close combat with macahuitls. And you can see three warriors here with their banners hanging out their backs, but they have their shields and they have their macahuitls and they're ready for battle. You'll notice the eagle warrior on the far left has that would have been a hardwood helmet that he's wearing over his head. There were also porters, because they did not have large domesticated animals like ox or horses, the ideal one in European warfare, or even camels. I know in South America they did have llamas, but for Mesoamerican society, to go to war, you had to bring all this stuff. And so for logistics, it fell upon a class of people known as tamame, or porters. And you can see one of these porters here depicted. You'll notice he's got a ton of gear strapped to his back, but even he's equipped with a Tiwa-speaking, one of those spear-like staff things. So he could also provide a support role in combat. He wasn't your first-rate fighter, but he could bolster your ranks in a pinch if you were having trouble. And there was usually in Aztec armies, at least one of these porters for every 2 warriors. So there's a lot of these guys coming along. So where does the conquest begin? Well, it begins, obviously the conquest of the New World starts in the Caribbean. It starts with the founding of La Navidad. We talked about this a bit when we talked about the legacy of the Taino in Puerto Rico and elsewhere in the Caribbean. These smaller populations, and I use this word relative because remember, these were very big populations that were dying of infectious disease. They did fall quickly to Spanish aggression and technological superiority. Also, there were Taino that sided with the Spanish, of course, as we've mentioned before, but they fell very quickly. Typically, these Spanish New World armies, without their indigenous components, were about 150 to 500 men strong. And they were organized not along the model of the Spanish tercio, but along medieval models. In fact, What you really have is an army that fought in Spain during the Reconquest, then an army that fought in the Italian Wars. So even though these armies are contemporary with the armies being fielded in Spain and in Italy during the 1500s, they actually look much more like the Spanish armies in the 1300s did than they did like the armies fighting in Europe. And they were equipped with a mixture of weaponry, but their most valuable items were the horses and lances. They also used dogs primarily as a terror tactic. We have a large, what looks like an Irish wolfhound there with the Spanish rider. These kind of dogs. They also used a lot of mastiffs and breeds like that, breeds similar to your modern day pit bull. And all of these guys, they're not professional soldiers. They're better described as adventuros than soldados. And so why bring in so many native peoples, or what made it possible for them to bring so many indigenous peoples into their armies? Well, first and foremost, these Mesoamerican civilizations offered central political authority with which the Spanish could interact with. They could build alliances. These people were used to the idea of lords and kings, and the idea of fealty and providing soldiers on campaign. All of these concepts were not alien to the people of Mesoamerica. And in most cases, these empires had large standing armies that were ready to go. They were trained and could conduct large-scale military campaigns. And for many of these nobles, the idea of integrating themselves into Spanish society was a valuable idea. They weren't just necessarily taken out of the equation. They became part of it. So if they had a reason to be upset with the political decisions of the Aztec Empire, they could become part of the Spanish Empire and operate the same way they always had as lords of their land. The most famous, probably person that you think of associated with the indigenous peoples, I just realized he's holding her out a human arm to eat in the picture. You can't unsee that once you see it. But the most famous is probably La Malinche. Her name was probably actually Malinali in Nahuatl, or Marina in Spanish. She was probably of noble birth. And she was given to Cortez in Tabasco, and he kind of accepted her as an interpreter and later as a consort. She sired his firstborn son. And really, she was the key to allowing the Spanish to navigate and capitalize on Mesoamerican politics, because not only could she speak the language, because she was of noble birth, she understood how people operated and what would be acceptable, what kind of deals they could make. I can't talk about the conquest of Mexico in any length. I often give this quote when I want to cop out of talking about the conquest of Mexico, and I'm going to do it here again. But if you want to sum it up in like a few sentences, here you go. During the course of what they term the conquest, the Europeans have, throughout these 450 leagues, butchered, burned alive, or otherwise done to death 4 million souls, young and old alike, men, women, and children. In no account, no matter how lengthy, how long it took to write, nor how conscientiously it was compiled, could possibly do justice to the full horror of the atrocities committed at one time or another in various parts of this region by the mortal enemies of the human race. So I'm not going to talk about the conquest of Mexico. But I do want to talk about how these armies come out of the conquest of Mexico. And by the end of the conquest of Mexico, these conquistador armies are enormous. You got, several hundred Spaniards are supported by thousands of native auxiliaries. And here we have a great example of Guzman attacking Michoacan, or the Perpetua, as it were, here. You can see Guzman riding his horse, but you'll notice most of the guys fighting for Guzman are Aztec warriors. The Spanish provide the horsemen and artillery, but the natives provide the foot and missile troops. In a lot of ways, if you'll notice, they're not really changed. These armies are still operating much like they had prior to contact. They wear all the same regalia. In fact, we have lots of accounts of Mexican soldiers defeating other indigenous peoples. This is an account from the Battle of Ashual that we get from Pedro Alvarado. This is Pedro Alvarado writing to the King of Spain. I ordered the retreat of all my forces, which consisted of 100 horsemen, 150 foot soldiers, and about 5,000 to 6,000 Indian allies. As we withdrew, I remained in the rear guard commanding the retreat. The enemy was greatly pleased and followed behind us. This is a group of Maya that he's fighting here. And since we were on a plain and there were no obstacles to impede either one of us, when I had retreated a quarter of a league to where they could no longer resort to flight, I turned back on them with all my men. We broke through them. They fell to the ground, and as they fell, our foot soldiers killed them all. What he's saying is he feigned retreat till he could get them onto level ground, and then his horses charged the formation of Mayan Indians. Once they were in disarray, the foot soldiers and Indian allies just kind of swooped in and killed them all. Here's another example. This is the Battle of Nochixtlan, as written by Francisco Sandoval Acacitli. The order that they had for the battle was that they set up the artillery in the middle, and on one side of the road went the Tlaxcalans, Tlaxcaltecas, Huetzotzincas, Cuauhtecas, followed by the Mexicanos and Zipoltecas, and then the Acoluas. And on the other side of those were the Michoacan, the Mestitlan, and the Chalcos. And they were setting up the artillery aimed at the wall of wood and then of stone, which left the Chichimecas without protection. And against them, Senor Don Francisco, with his green feathered insignia of wide quetzal plumes, which they gained the wall and broke it, burned their huts, and began to fight with them. It was there that all those from the provinces took many captives, and no more than 4 Spaniards died in this battle. This is an account which pretty much shows that the Spanish were the Spanish themselves weren't really engaged in the fighting. It was primarily the indigenous peoples of all these different nations fighting Spain's enemies. Only 4 Spaniards died as a result of that battle. They're bragging about it. One of the things we hear a lot is took many captives, and it's strange to say that traditional practices died hard among many of the Mesoamerican soldiers. There are many accounts of sacrifices, genocidal executions, and cannibalism of captives by Mesoamerican soldiers. Some Spaniards, such as Guzman, attempted to curtail these activities. Others, Guzman, remember, he put his own natives in chains. You can almost imagine that he saw them potentially enslaving other indigenous peoples and possibly sacrificing them to their gods. And he's like, we can't have any of this. And he even takes his own natives and puts them in chains. Whereas other Spaniards, such as Alvarado, actually embrace these practices. They not only let their Mesoamerican soldiers take part in these activities, but also allowed themselves to be associated with Mesoamerican war gods. In this case, with Alvarado, it was Tonatiuh. Specifically regarding Alvarado, and I've given this quote many times, but this gives you an idea of what Alvarado was doing in his camp. It says, since he never fed the 10 or 20,000 impressed natives in his army, he gave them leave to eat the prisoners they took, thus setting the royal seal of approval on the establishment in his camp of human abattoir, where he himself would preside over the slaughter and grilling of children, and where grown men were butchered for the sake of their hands and feet, which were generally held to be the best cuts. Certainly, indigenous society was being transformed as a result of this. It couldn't, it had to. And the shift was that the Spanish represented the highest echelon of power, followed by the native nobility. So here we have a picture of Cortez. Cortez is lecturing to or talking with the Aztec nobles, who then below them are their wives and servants and the other people that are underneath them that are giving offerings and stuff like that. So the order is Spanish at the top, native nobility middle, and then the native serfs down below that. In many of these indigenous peoples, these indigenous nobles in particular, became converts to Christianity and began to intermarry with the Spanish. In many ways, they became more Christian and loyal, more loyal to the Catholic Church, and more loyal to the King of Spain than many of the conquistadors. A great example of this is Ajotl II. Ajotl II actually was with Alvarado when he was committing these atrocities, and he said, as a good Christian, I can't stand, I can't stand by and watch us eat people or do any bad things, right? He couldn't do it. So he gathers up all his soldiers and he heads back to Mexico. And here he builds the first Franciscan temple. Ajotl immediately ordered all the remaining nobles and lords to take a jacal and carry the building materials for the Franciscan temple. Ajotl, as their leader, was the first to pick up a big jacal made from a tiger's hide that was full of stone. He led the nobles to Mexico, laden with the stone, lime, and sand. Others followed them, pulling wood. Loaded as they were, they went straight to the place that Ajotl had designated years ago for the Franciscan Church of San Jose. In those days, Mass was said beneath a very tall cross. Others who didn't necessarily turn their backs on the Spanish actually settled in the areas they conquered. And a lot of Mexica Indians settled in other locations, such as Guatemala, El Salvador, and Honduras. Here's a great example from Gonzalo Ortiz. And these Indian conquistadors of New Spain, having conquered and won this land, stayed in large numbers to settle the old city of Almolonga, which is near to Guatemala, where they and their children and descendants now are and live. And many Spanish captains went out from the city of Guatemala with many people to conquer and settle the provinces of Cuzlacatlan, which the Spaniards now call San Salvador, and that the province of Honduras. And this witness saw that with these captains went many Indians, among those Mexica, Tlaxcalteca, Choluteca, and Mixteca conquistadors, and those from other nations. The extent of the conquest. So within most of the New World, or a substantial portion of the New World, I shouldn't say most of the New World, but the majority of the lands conquered by Mesoamerican conquistadors occurred in a single generation, from about 1520 to 1545. Why did it all happen in a single generation? Well, that was the generation of first contact, right? That was the generation in which Cortez arrived. That was the generation in which they were used to fighting in their Aztec traditions. Unfortunately, the reason why this ended rather rapidly is disease sweeps, coupled with the breakdown of these civilizations, the spread of Catholicism, and new Spanish military programs reduced the need for large professional armies. So you couldn't mount huge armies like this after about 1545. It just wasn't possible. But they had conquered a lot of land in the meantime. Now, mind you, this map is from much later, but it gives you a good idea of the extent. These later programs are also important to mention here, and I'm only going to mention them briefly, but the first is the Fletchero Program. The Fletchero Program translates into archer bowman. It was pretty much the idea that every community in Mesoamerica had a peasant levy. So these weren't the jaguar warriors or the eagle warriors. These are locals in the various villages, and that if your village wanted to retain its land rights and its water rights, pretty much you had to pledge to supply some level of soldiers for a campaign, and if there was a campaign needed in the region. So if a Spaniard arrived with his 50 or so, or even at this point, 25 Spaniards to conduct war on a town that wasn't paying tribute, all the other towns that were paying tribute needed to supply soldiers as part of their commitment to the Spanish cause. And this was this was more important not as a conquest mechanism, but as a mechanism for crushing revolts. The other program, which you may be more familiar with here in New Mexico, is, of course, the Hemissaro Program. The Hemissaro Program is the idea of taking Native Americans as either slaves or servants, often as children. They're indoctrinated into Christianity and then resettled in frontier villages with the idea that if a native tribe, such as the Comanche, were to attack New Mexico, before they hit Albuquerque, or they would hit Tomei, or if Navajo or Apache or Ute peoples were going to travel along the Chama with the idea of raiding Santa Fe, the first place they would hit was a Hemissaro settlement known as Albuquerque. These buffer communities were places to serve to protect the where the Spanish colonists live. And the whole program is actually derives from a Turkish program. And we talked about this Turkish program last time, which is the Janissary program. This was a tactic that the Ottoman Turks used, except they took Christian children and indoctrinated them into fundamentalist Islam and taught them to be soldiers. Well, the Spanish did the same thing, only with their Native American subjects. Okay, so what's the legacy? I'm going to wrap this up so if we have any questions, we have time for questions. First of all, the legacy of the Indian conquistador, certainly it's more than the conquest of lands and the subjugation of natives. It initiated the spread of Mesoamerican peoples and culture to areas not previously controlled by the Aztec and Tarascan empires. So, for example, there are large portions of Mexico today which never had Mexica people living in them, but as a result of these conquests and these colonial ventures, lots of them got there. More importantly, if you look at Central America and you go, oh, there's kind of a general consensus about what Central American culture looks like today. A lot of that is based upon these Mexica peoples moving in and bringing their culture to it. It's not to discount other indigenous peoples that were already in the area, but certainly these people played a very important role in it, specifically those who lived within the Aztec and Tarascan empires. I do want to give this quote because I think this is a very fitting quote. And he saw that at the time there came to help in the conquest a great quantity of Indian friends, Indios amigos, natives of Tlaxcala, and Mexicans, and natives of Cholula, and Zapoteca, and Mixteca, and Yope, and from, I'm not going to even pronounce that word, all friends of the Spaniards, who after coming to his land, this witness saw in the service of our God, our Lord, and of your majesty, were at all the battles and encounters, and served very well with their persons and their arms, suffering much exhaustion and hunger and deprivation and many wounds over many years, until the land was conquered and pacified and placed under the domination of your majesty. What Pedro Gonzalez Najera is saying is that they couldn't have done it without the natives. And that's absolutely the case. The anonymous conquistador had one more thing to say about him. He said they eat people and they have a kind of pepper for seasoning that is called chili, and nothing is eaten without it. So when you start to think about our own state logo of red or green, think about what that really means. All right, I got all my contact information here, but you know that you can always email me with questions and comments. You're welcome to unmute yourself and ask away.
So I know you've said that when Coronado came, that he came with a lot of indigenous people from Mexico.
Yes.
Do they have any idea of what the makeup of this group was?
Yeah. So I think David Snow is going to give some compelling arguments in his article that comes out later this year. I think most of the peoples that came up with Coronado, based upon where Coronado was stationed, were likely of pure Pecha from the Tarascan Empire. So peoples from the Tarascan Empire. That's based upon the fact that we know a lot of the logistical support came from the area in and around Guadalajara. Even though that area was filled with Coxcanes, the Coxcanes hated the Spanish at that point. So it was very likely Tarascans. Later on, with the settlement of Santa Fe, Elizabeth Oster gives a very compelling argument that Coxcanes were probably, and Tarascans were the principal peoples that participated in establishing the Barrio de Analco. This runs counter to traditional thoughts and most traditional arguments about Indios Amigos or about allied Indian forces. The first group that's brought to mind is always the Tlaxcala. They were the most famous supporters of the Spanish, primarily because they hated the Aztecs, and they were the first to join the Spanish. However, they may not have been the most numerous. In fact, Xotl II, who we talked about briefly in this talk, was actually a much more important ally for Cortez and later Alvarado than than necessarily the Tlaxcalan Confederacy was. As oh God, I want to say he was the Lord of Texcoco, but I could be wrong about that. He was the Lord of one of the three cities of the Triple Alliance, or he was the cast out Lord. He had actually lost his position and be given smaller holdings. He had a massive army that he pledged to Cortez, and he pledged that army after Cortez had been booted out of Tenochtitlan. So the argument could be made that if Xotl hadn't stepped up in support of the Spanish, and he was baptized as Hernan Cortez. So if I want to use his Christian name, Hernan Cortez was helped by Hernan Cortez. If that doesn't make a lot of sense, I know. But at any rate, the Native American Hernan Cortez was probably the most pivotal of all Native American conquistadors. And it's very interesting because he's an interesting figure, primarily because he worked to commit all of these atrocities and then eventually decided that as a good Christian person, he couldn't participate in it anymore. That him and his followers would not, he promised to kill his own mother if she didn't convert to Catholicism. But at the end of the day, he loved the Christian God so much that he gave it all up and decided to build a gigantic mission for the Franciscans to convert his fellow indigenous peoples to Catholicism. He thought that that was their primary role. In fact, he's a good argument for the spiritual conquest in many ways because he became so enamored with Christianity later on in his life. That's a long answer. There's another question here from Todd Griffin. What role did native peoples play in the subjugation of the Inca? Lots. In fact, believe it or not, Alvarado, that guy that had his natives with him, he actually shows up in Peru at one point. And the Pizarro brother, the Pizarros are scared because they're like, we can't have this guy. This guy's a loose cannon. We can't have him here. And so they some of Pizarro's crew meets him on the shoreline and explains to Alvarado, we're already conquering this area. You can't be a part of this. Alvarado, for his own part, goes, okay. And he packs up his stuff and goes back to, at this point, he's the governor of Guatemala. He goes and packs off his stuff to Guatemala, but he leaves a lot of his Mexica Indians behind to help with the conquest. So it's important to note that Mexica were in Peru even. They even imported Mexica Indians into Cambodia to fight campaigns in Cambodia. Now you say to yourself, what was Spain doing in Cambodia? For a period of time, Spain was looking to make Cambodia part of its colonial holdings in Asia. Mexica Indians fought in the Philippines. Mexica Indians fought. Mexica Indian blood is found amongst the Taino in Puerto Rico, and the Puerto Rican populations have Mexica blood in them because they brought these Mexica everywhere to fight their wars. You even find Mexica pottery, or I shouldn't say Mexica pottery. You even find pottery from the Guadalajara area, which is based on Aztec 4. This may have been made by Tarascans. This may have been made by Coxcanes. This may have been made by Mexica. You find it in Europe, for Christ's sakes. These guys got everywhere. They went everywhere. Were they a major component of armies in Europe? No. Were they a major component of armies in Asia? Yes. Were they a major component in armies in Central and South America? Absolutely. Were they a major component of armies in the conquest of New Mexico? Absolutely. Yeah. Coronado definitely had a large army made up primarily of Native American conquistadors. These guys got around. Did the Mesoamerican warriors play a role in the Battle of Acoma? I don't know. I don't remember, and I haven't read that account in a very long time. But they were probably there, but I don't remember in the account. And I assume you're talking about the battle in which Oñate fought, not I don't remember if Coronado fought in the battle at Acoma or not. Yeah, he says yes. In the Battle Oñate fought. My guess is absolutely. In fact, I made the argument many, many years ago now, and whether I still agree with it or not, I don't know. But I made the argument that I thought, and David Snow had made the argument before me, so other people had done it before me. But at the time, I was very convinced of it. I'm not sure I'm as convinced now, but at the time, I believed that all the Capo Black, Pahogee polychrome, Tewa polychrome, all of the historic wares that you see in New Mexico that made by Pueblo peoples were all copies of things you found in Mesoamerica. And I still partially believe that. I don't know if I believe it as strongly as before. Capo is probably the best example. Capo is nearly identical to Oaxaca polished black wares that you find in central Mexico, in the Valley of Oaxaca today. There was no polished blackware tradition until the native peoples of Mexico made it up into New Mexico. It's also, obviously our tradition of eating red and green chili, right? The very thing that defines New Mexicans is a trait that comes from the Mexica and their love of chili. That is not a tradition that comes out of the indigenous peoples of New Mexico. It's not a tradition that comes out of the Spanish. It's a tradition that comes out of the Mexican Indians that came up and settled the area. So when you are eating your red and green, and your red and green chilies, you are eating the way a Mexica Indian ate. And when you eat it with pork, you're probably eating as close as you can legally eat to how they ate on campaign. Oh, somebody asked me, so does the best chili come from Mexico or New Mexico? I think Ron asked that. He's smiling really bad now. It comes from New Mexico because we are New Mexico Historic Sites and we are residents of New Mexico. I don't want to hear about how chili's grown better. They have different peppers down there, and those are, I mean, I'll tell you, if you're a chili fanatic, obviously support our local businesses. But if you want to try some of the chilies from Central Mexico, there's some great chilies from Central Mexico, and you can get a lot of diversity down there. So I do encourage you to embrace it. If you can. There are some traditional Mexican restaurants. I know traditional Mexican normally means like it's not real Mexican food in a lot of ways, not like the stuff you get south of the border sometimes. But you can get some stuff that's really good. You just have to be careful about where you go. Of course, right now I'm like, I should give a recommendation to a restaurant in Albuquerque, but I can't right now. I can't even think of one right now off the top of my head. Somebody else, Steve Patchett said, you can have Mexican chili or New Mexican chili, just don't get Colorado chili. And I think we'd all agree to that. So I think that's fair. I would hope that you try out a lot of different things. But even you want to get into strange things. I love paprika, right? And paprika is based upon chilies, and stuff like that. So you can go the whole world. It's the world is your oyster. If you like spicy foods, there's a lot of different options out there. A lot of different chili variants out there. All right. Well, if there are no further questions, I'm going to hang up and I'm going to go back and check on my employees out there. I'm not telling you to get out of your house, especially if you feel nervous about it. Please don't do it. But if you have the time and you need a mental health break, come visit us, Coronado and Hemissaro Historic Sites. Bye, guys.